and to tell you that Jesus did not break the rules. He broke man's traditions. Jesus kept God's law, and he said, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill the law. That's correct. I want you to look at this quote, and if there's a message that you take home today, it's this. This is a quote from a book called Principles to Live By, written by an Adventist minister, Pastor Mel Reese. And he had to say this in the book: God ordained that man should live by principles, not by rules. And today I want to take a little bit of time unpicking this to help us understand why there was this clash between Jesus and the religious rulers of the time. What is the difference between principles and rules? And why are principles so much more important than rules? Some of you will have grown up in the 70s, as I did, and some of you will have gone to Ponsonby Church, as I did. And you may remember that in Ponsonby Church we had certain church rules that we had to abide by. Rules that govern our dress, the food we ate, the music we listened to, and so forth. In my generation, the fashion was bell-bottom trousers and platform shoes. I'm hoping that fashion never comes back again. But in our church, we weren't allowed to wear bell-bottom trousers or platform shoes. Girls were not allowed to wear makeup or jewelry. We weren't allowed to have guitars or drum kits in church. We could have drums that you play with a band, a brass band, that's fine. But drum kits, no. That was a rule that we had back then. And those rules, when you're young, you find it hard to understand why so many rules and why these particular rules. It soon became evident as I grew up that these rules were based on principles that govern, in fact, all the rules that we experience through life. And the principles that governed rules of dress in our church back then were modesty, not to dress and to wear clothes, not to draw attention to yourself. Another principle is the principle of bringing your best before God. I remember people saying, you wouldn't wear that to go and see the Queen. Why would you wear it to church to see God? Today we don't seem to have those stringent rules, do we, in church? And perhaps because we've come to realize over time that perhaps a young man or a young woman wearing jeans and a t-shirt and joggers, that might be all they have to wear to church. They might be traveling between cities or going somewhere else, and they didn't come prepared with a suit and tie for church. And maybe that's their best that they're bringing to church, their cleanest t-shirt. It may be that wearing a kilt might be the best formal dress that they have, or a sari might be the best that they can bring. But I think we've learned over time to distinguish between the rules that we're raised with and the principles that apply to those rules. Do you understand? And so I want to draw on this some lessons for us to take home. The first lesson is this: rules are based on principles. Rules do not exist by themselves. They are drawn from a principle that underpins it or overarches the law or the rule. Think of any rule you care to, and there is an underlying principle that governs it. And as parents, we find it very difficult to teach our children principles, although we ought to, and that's what I want to tell us today. We ought to teach our children principles because they don't understand the principle, but they can certainly understand the rule. It's a lot easier. Our road rules today are based on the principle of safety. Our contract laws today are based on the principles of equality or fairness for all parties. Our second lesson is that rules may change, but principles never change. If you think of our road rules, we drive on the left. The principle is safety. In America, they drive on the right. The principle is the same, safety. And if you've got a pool at home, you will have rules around the pool that you apply for safety. The road rules don't apply around your pool. The pool rules do. At Mount Sinai, God gave the Ten Commandments to Israel as the eternal guiding principles. We often think of that as being the law, but really the Ten Commandments were God's principles. At the same time, around the same time, God gave, through Moses, more specific and wide-ranging laws that we call the Law of Moses, that governed the way they were to live daily lives under these guiding principles of the Ten Commandments. So we need to understand that there is a difference between God's law, or God's principles, and the law of Moses, which was the application of that law. You know, sometimes, I don't know if you'll remember this, probably, you hope you do. There will be times when your parents would have told you to go and do the dishes. And you wouldn't have wanted to go. It wasn't convenient at the time. But you went and did it anyway. And you did the dishes, but your heart wasn't in there. In doing that, your mind was elsewhere. That's the law. And now you're a little bit older. Perhaps you've got your own house, your own family, and you see the dishes stacking up in the sink, and you think, I really need to do the dishes. And when you do the dishes in that situation, that's applying the principle of hygiene or cleanliness. Do you see the difference? The law is a dry, sterile application of the principle. And this is where we find Israel and sometimes our churches, that we are keeping the law but missing the underlying principle. The third rule I'd like us to consider is this, that rules are enforceable, but principles are a willing choice. Principles are not enforceable. When you think about it, you have that choice. Jesus tried to teach us this difference to his disciples when in Matthew 5, verse 20, he says this, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." That's quite a serious consequence. But Jesus was trying to teach them, in other words, that our obedience and observance of the law should be a willing choice driven by the key principle of our love for God. The righteousness of the Pharisees was based on their keeping the letter of the law, and their life, the lives they were leading, were not the lives they were living, did not live up to the principles of the law. So their righteousness was by works, their pious lives were spiritually empty. Jesus taught and lived principles. If you studied the life of Christ, everything he did was based on principles. When you think about prior to the Ten Commandments were given to Israel in Mount Sinai. Prior to that, there's no written commandments. So what existed before the Ten Commandments? God's principles. And those principles were handed down through time from Adam to Noah to Abraham to Moses. And we see those principles applying prior to the Ten Commandments coming. So it's so important for us to remember that the Ten Commandments is a writing down of God's 10 principles. It's interesting that people complain about keeping the 10 Commandments. They say, there's a whole lot of thou shalt nots. We focus on the thou shalt nots. And really, when you think about it, it's only the last 6 that say thou shalt not. So there's really only 6 commandments about thou shalt nots. What they fail to focus on is what you can do. You can bless others. There's a lot of positive stuff that people don't focus on when they talk about the 10 Commandments and what we can do. In teaching about the law, Jesus drew, and this is the 10 Commandments, drew attention to the underlying principles of the 10 Commandments. Here's an example, Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 and 22. You have heard it said, people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister is subject to judgment. The point Jesus was making here is you might be keeping the law, the letter of the law, but if in your thoughts you're considering or thinking about, or you're angry with your brother or sister, that also is a breaking of the principles of the law. Do you understand? In Matthew 5, verses 28 and 27, 28, you have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. That's quite serious stuff. In other words, keeping the letter of the law doesn't result in righteous living if all the while one's thoughts are consumed by selfish lusts. So rule number 4 I'd like us to consider is, or rather lesson number 4, is that rules need no intelligence. Principles need a higher form of intelligence. If you have a dog and you tell your dog where to go, how to sit, or where to sit, the dog will obey your rules, your commands. There's no intelligence involved in that. But the same with computers. You could program a computer to do a certain thing. But when you ask the computer to decide something like the human intelligence, a computer can't do that. Here's a quote from Mel Reese, Principles to Live By, page 5. To apply a principle requires intelligence of a higher order, both mental and moral courage. God ordained that man should live by principles and not by rules. Lesson number 5. Man prefers to follow rules than to apply principles. And this is very true when you think about when you're speeding along the road and somebody smiled as if they know what's going on. When you drive past a speed camera at speed and you get a ticket, that's the rule, that's the law. You've broken the speed limit. But when it comes time to applying the principle, sometimes we struggle with that. I don't know if you remember a jingle that the New Zealand Transport Safety Board put on radio in the last year or two. I want to start the jingle and see if you can finish it for me, okay? Sing it out. It's not a jingle that I'm going to sing, it's just words. Drive to the conditions. If they change, how do you finish it? Reduce your speed. Drive to the conditions. If they change, reduce your speed. Can you see that that's the difference between applying the law, the speed limit, and applying common sense, if you like, or the principle of safety on the road? It doesn't matter what the speed limit is. If the speed limit's 100 and you're driving at 50 and it's dangerous to drive at 50 because of the conditions, you should slow down. That's the principle of safety, applying the principle. So man finds it easier and prefers rules than applying the principle. God ordained that man should live by principles, not by rules. So, what are some of the principles we're called to live by Jesus and from the Bible? There are many that I believe we already instinctively know, and I'm going to list out a few of them. Love and obedience, honor and respect, truth and honesty, integrity and trustworthiness, loyalty and service, stewardship and humility, faith and trust. These are all principal words, and these are the principles that I think God would want us to teach our children, to teach our community, to live by the principles. It doesn't mean the rules don't apply anymore, but it means we understand the rules, and we know that we shouldn't break the rules because you're breaking a principle, the underlying principle. So let's go to the Bible and see some of the more critical principles that Jesus taught. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. It's just a few that were picked up for us this morning. The first is the seek first principle, Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Jesus taught this principle in the context of teaching his disciples not to worry. God provides all that we need. There is nothing we need to worry about if we leave ourselves in God's care. We need to trust and have faith in God and leave everything, all our worries and concerns, in His hands. The subtext to this principle is the old hymn, Trust and Obey. Thank you. In the course of my career, I've had the privilege of reading, listening, and watching many international motivational speakers. Speakers like Napoleon Hill, Zig Ziglar, Stephen Covey, Tim Robbins. But do you know what I've discovered about these guys? Not just that they're polished and professional, not just that they're informative and entertaining, but they all taught principles. And the amazing thing was that many of the principles that they taught are actually principles taught and found in the Bible. Here are a few examples. This is a quote from Napoleon Hill. Whatever the mind of man can conceive and believe, it can achieve. That's a principle, and it's found in Proverbs 23 and verse 7. As he thinks, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. Another example, in his book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Steve Covey, as his habit number 3, put this title, Put First Things First, which again is an echo of Matthew 6:33, seek first the kingdom of God. In other words, put your priorities in the right order. Here are a few others that I've copied from the internet, but which are more generalized. From Zig Ziglar, and I love this man's presentations. Your attitude, the way you think, not your aptitude, your abilities, will determine your altitude. Did you get that? When I did a training in sales training many years ago, our lecturer at the time said that there was a survey, and I forget all the details about the survey, about the difference between attitude and aptitude. And they surveyed many of the very successful people, CEOs of corporations and large companies, and they said, what do you put your success down to? Your attitude or your aptitude, your skills? And 80% said their success was based on their attitude, the way they approached a problem, the way they solved or crossed a barrier. So it's very important. That's a very important quote, I think, for us to live by. There are 3, from Steve Covey, this quote, there are 3 constants in life: change, choice, and principles. And these might be just, single sentence principles, but you can sense there's a much deeper meaning to them, isn't there? Again, from Steve Covey, do the important thing, not the urgent thing. Can you see the difference? An application of that might be if you're having dinner with your family and the phone rings, which is the important and which is the urgent? The phone is the urgent, but what's important? Having dinner with your family. Don't answer the phone. Turn it off when you're having dinner with your family. Some great quotes. Here's one from Nelson Mandela. It always seems impossible until it's done. And I picked this quote because it seemed to be relevant to our current consideration of the catering opportunity that's open to us. At the moment, it seems impossible, but it's only impossible until it's done, with God's help, of course. Here's another principle: have faith and do not fear. Numbers 14 verses 1 to 4 tells the story of how Israel failed to go into the promised land because they feared the inhabitants. They didn't have faith, instead they feared. 1 Samuel 17 verses 48 and 49 tells the story of how David conquered Goliath because he had faith. He did not have fear. We ought not to fear anything. Some in recent days or recent weeks, some have expressed to me their concern over recent events, particularly their fear of the Sunday law coming into effect. And they've said to me, we should do something as a church to stop this. We should at least try, to stop this. And I say, no, don't stop it. It's been prophesied that it will happen. And it's not something we should celebrate, but it's something we need to accept, that this is a sure sign of the last days and of Jesus' soon return. We need to be ready. The next principle I want us to look at, we'll go back a bit. Sister White says this about the last days, and it applies to this principle of having faith and not fear. And there's a preface to this in her writing. It says, the devil in consultation with his angels was overheard to say, I will make the observance of the seventh day a sign of disloyalty to the authorities on earth. Human laws will be made so stringent that men and women will not dare to observe the seventh day Sabbath. For fear of wanting food and clothing, they will join with the world in transgressing God's law. Brothers and sisters, it is coming, and we should accept it as part of prophecy and realize that we are in the last days. Stay away from the edge, another very important principle that we need to apply. James 4 verse 17 says this, submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. In other words, don't venture to places where you will be tempted to step over the edge. Learn to recognize temptation. I wonder how many of us this morning, and I'll ask you rhetorically, how many of us would know when you are being tempted? Do we recognize it when we are tempted? Sometimes we'll say, I know I shouldn't. I shouldn't eat that chocolate. I know I shouldn't, but... And we reach out and eat the chocolate. Do we ever realize that that is us being tempted? And that might be a minor temptation you're thinking of, but really, temptation is temptation is temptation. And we need to recognize temptation in order to be able to resist that temptation and the devil flee from us. Be prepared, a very important principle. 1 Peter 3:15, but in your hearts revere God or sanctify God as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and with respect. Herb Larson, a lay preacher, Adventist lay preacher, puts it this way. If you don't have a story to tell about Jesus, you haven't met him yet. Being prepared takes practice. We need to exercise being prepared. I have the great honor and pleasure of coaching our school's under-17 basketball team at ASDA. I teach them the theory because I can't practice it anymore. I'm too old. But to grow, they have to practice what I'm telling them to do. They practice to make their skills automatic and instinctive, to build their muscle memory so that when they need to act or to react, they do it instinctively as a natural reflex. So it is with us. In building our relationship with God, we need to pray and fast. We need to fill our hearts with God's word so that when we are tested, our response will be as instinctive as Jesus' response, it is written. That should be our response when we are tempted. God ordained that man should live by principles, not by rules. And there are many other principles Jesus taught, and it would be well for us to learn them and to apply them. It should be clear by now that the message I want you to take home today is this: God ordained that man should live by principles, not by rules. Jesus taught and lived principles. We ought also to live and teach God's principles to our children and family. We need to choose willingly to apply in our lives the principles that Jesus taught. By doing so, I believe our lives will become filled with spiritual meaning and with purpose, and our Christianity will no longer be just obeying the letter of the law. Thank you.